Hey everyone. So, I promised my next video would be on another character that was cut from the game's story. I'm actually working on that video right now, but there were a few other things I left out in my last video that I neglected to mention for time. I was just going to include it as part of the character video, but I feel it would just pad out the video and feel a little tonally inconsistent. So I've decided to make this video now and address some of the stuff that I left out in the last one. In my last video, I briefly referenced a scene where Snow White was being pushed by Bigby, and said that I had a theory about why this was the case. Well, I'm gonna let you down a little bit, because it's not a super fleshed out theory or anything. In my opinion, Snow White in this scene is actually not Snow White. I mean, she is, obviously, but she's not. I think they used Snow White's model in place of another character. I really only have two pieces of evidence to support this, but the biggest being that obviously Bigby would never push Snow so aggressively like that. The other reason is more grounded. I want you to pay close attention to the background of this shot. Do you recognise it at all? Well, in the final game, this is actually Beauty and Beast's apartment. But the truth is, this was not always their home. It was reused like many other things from the original story. The textures that made up this house are titled with the name White Queen, so obviously this place originally belonged to someone named the White Queen. Like Cinderella, there are generic animations for this character, but of course we never actually see or hear about them in the final game. And just for reference, the White Queen is related to the story of Alice in Wonderland. Kinda like the Red Queen, except white. The agents file in the game archives lists the models that have been set up for each episode. Episode 2's agent file includes characters that were set up, but not yet seen, like the Crooked Man, or straight up cut characters like the White Queen and glamoured Mr. Toad. There's mention of being able to walk around her home and mention of a chess puzzle that Bigby would need to solve. She also has some FX animations. For the longest time, I chalked this up as a character that just got cut and never saw the light of day. That was until a friend of mine discovered something big. After Telltale's collapse, concept artist Derek Stratton released some early concept art for Wolf. Some are particularly interesting, like this image of a mouse. I can only assume this is concept art of the three blind mice? I'm not sure. There's another of a character simply named Charming. Prince Charming? There's also some hands images that— oh god! There's Georgie art, Faith, Prince Lawrence, Tiny Tim. There's even some concept art of card soldiers, obviously related to the Queen. But more importantly is concept art of the White Queen herself. A friend of mine did a search of White Queen through all of the game's text. As it turns out, the White Queen is actually in the final game, and is actually the character of Auntie Greenleaf. It seems so obvious now, but pretty much all her animations address her as Greenleaf. And the only evidence we have besides the concept art is that our prop file has the text, White Queen. Unfortunately, we don't exactly know what her role or character was, but I get the impression she was probably still the same type of person, who knows more than she lets on. Moving on to other characters, I want to talk about Tiny Tim. I don't have too much to say about him other than a few things I didn't talk about in the previous video for time. It's pretty damn clear he played some purpose in the original story. He was there from the start. That we know 100%. What we don't know is what that role was. There are two unused models in the game files called Scrooge Apartment TV and Scrooge Apartment Couch. The models themselves are pretty unremarkable. What's more is that there's a texture titled Anderson Street Scrooge Apartment Number. Well, I checked Anderson Street and I couldn't find jack shit. It's pretty clear that Scrooge in this case is Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, and Tiny Tim is very likely related to that. And that's all I had to say about Tim. There's nothing to go on, honestly. Then I made a very recent discovery. In fact, it was so recent, I discovered it while editing my last video. There's concept art of Bullfinch Street, the street just outside the Woodland Apartments. We can see Bigby standing on the street next to a large bloodstain, with prints that lead into or from the nearby house. The house itself looks quite familiar. I checked this out in-game and it's still there. Unfortunately, there's no modelled interior though, so there's nothing to see. It just raises more questions. Questions we'll probably never get answers to. So let's talk about Mr. Toad. In the final game, his big story arc that never resolves itself is that he is constantly without a glamour. Bigby spends a lot of the time chastising Toad about it, but he still doesn't bother to get one. In the end, he gets shipped off to the farm. Well, originally, Toad was meant to be seen glamoured quite often throughout the story. His glamoured version is referenced in the files of episode 1, but without his model or textures, so we have no idea what he looks like. That was until episode 4 released, and with it came a bunch of extra unnecessary files. The voice lines I showed off before, very early Woodsman textures meant for another model, some unused text we'll talk about in a bit, and of course, Mr. Toad's glamoured model. And if you kept in mind what I said before about things being reused, then it won't surprise you to learn that Mr. Toad's glamoured model is actually just the Jersey Devil's glamoured model. It looks so obvious when you compare the two. The scene with Mr. Toad in his apartment building was originally quite different. In the final game, Bigby spots Dumb messing around in the Woodsman's apartment, runs up there, only to hear Mr. Toad yelling at his son, to which he investigates with Snow downstairs. It makes no sense at all, because there's nowhere Dumb could have gone. And if Bigby can hear Toad yelling, why wouldn't he be able to hear Dumb busting down his door and the struggle Toad had with him? Well, in case it isn't obvious, this scene went through multiple variations, and it's hard to categorize. But thankfully for us, there are still some leftover scenes in the files that we can view that help us understand how it was supposed to play out. Toad would be cleaning up the mess from Bigby's fight the night before. Bigby would drop by and ask him about the Woodsman, to which Toad would say he hasn't seen him since last night.
What were you doing? Appears that way.
What?
I just fixed it. I was planning on coming by anyway.
Bigby would comment on his glamour failing, with one of his eyes being a toad eye instead of a human one.
Mr. Toad, I think there may be something wrong with your eye.
Bigby would ask Toad a few questions before telling him and Snow to sit down while he investigates the apartment.
Look, clock's ticking. You've already messed with the crime scene enough. Sit over there while I look around. You absolutely sure you haven't seen the Woodsman since last night? There's gotta be something here to tell me where he went. We all seem to be searching for the Woodsman.
It seems that way, yeah.
Let me have a look around. Maybe he missed something.
Bigby would then search the Woodsman's belongings to try and find out where he could be.
This must be his regular place. Thought I might get lucky again.
Bigby would eventually discover a bar tab leading him to the trip trap, as well as a cupboard with a missing medal.
Fresh. Someone's been in my crime scene.
Bigby would ask Toad about it, to which he would deny knowing anything about.
You touched this? So, what was in here? You broke it. It smells like you, Toad. Did you touch this? Idea what this is? Got a bloody print on it. Could be yours. You realize this is a crime scene, right? So, did you take anything from this room? Whose blood is it then? It doesn't add up. Your blood over there, in this Splinter story?
If Bigby lost his temper with Toad, this scene would play out.
Alright, I'm not fucking around anymore, Toad! We had the chance to do this nice!
No!
I don't like you like that.
There. Better? It's me.
Sorry, Dad.
Shh, no. You did good. You did good.
Look, file a damage report with the business office. Then I'll see what I can do.
What happened with the car?
In my altercation with the Woodsman, we ended up going out the window, and I landed on it.
Oh, well, if you were the cause of it, then we should pay for it. Mr. Toad, please submit a report with the damages Mr. Wolf has caused you, and we'll look into getting you reimbursed.
As you can see, it's basically a prototype of the investigation that happens in Toad's apartment.
What?
Mr. Toad?
He's not here. This is the sheriff. What do you want?
Bigby! Oh,
Yeah? It's me. Snow? It's a start. I'm leaving anyway. Hey, Snow.
Yeah, I was
Bigby.
looking for a room for rent.
I need you to come back to the office. I told him about the girl, and he'd like to speak with us about it.
I just found out where the girl lives. I should go talk to her husband.
Oh. So, what are you going to do?
Sorry. I gotta follow up on this.
Fine. I'll try and smooth things over, but be careful. Her husband may still be a suspect.
Okay. I'll be right over.
Thank you, Bigby.
And that's about it for Mr. Toad. Still weird to think he was going to be a playable protagonist at one point. The last thing to talk about is unused text, and by God, is there a lot of it. It's actually incredibly difficult to discuss because there's just so much of it. I'm not going to address every cut line, just show off and discuss what I think are worth mentioning. What's worth pointing out is that quite a lot of dialogue related to Faith's murder is cut that would help the player further understand what happened. For example, Bigby says this. We do get an account of this from Toad Jr., but I think Bigby saying it makes it more clear. It obviously implies that Lily was already dead when they threw her in the river. Crane was also supposed to say this. A clear hint of his obsession with her. Then there's these two lines about punishing someone. Not sure what this is supposed to be referring to. Probably related to the Crooked Man in some way. Gren says some very un-Gren-like things here. Episode 2's next time on has a bunch of cut Georgie lines that straight out implicate him as to having a connection with the Crooked Man. There's also cut text related to Vivian, Georgie's partner? Girlfriend? Wife? Come to think of it, we know so little about Vivian. She's a pretty significant part of the plot. I'm curious as to why Bigby never thought to ask her directly about Faith or Lily. Well, as it turns out, it seems like she was supposed to come to us. Looking more into it, there's a scrap scene at the business office where Vivian would come in and speak to Bigby. On a side note, the text file for this scene implies that the Tweedles would have suffered severe casualties from the funeral fight, also implying that Bigby would have killed one of them. Colin would be there to support Bigby in the business office, who was unconscious after the fight. Anyway, getting back to Vivian, there's a lot of lines here, so just pause the video if you want to read them. This is pretty enlightening. It gives us a deeper understanding of what Georgie and Vivian's relationship was. I'm pretty sure this is not canon anymore though. But as is usually the case with cut content, it's interesting to see how different things are from the final game. The confrontation with Crane at the Pudding and Pie also has some cut dialogue from Vivian where she tries to implicate Crane and defends the Crooked Man. More interesting though is cut text from the scene where Mary shows up, as it mentions Georgie being present. Georgie has no balls at all in the final game, as he just lets everyone do what they want. It's interesting to see him actually make threats here, but it also gives us two incredibly important clues. The first thing being the whole laughing thing. Toad Jr. mentions hearing this, which pretty much confirms it was Mary and Georgie that got rid of Lily's body. Well, until they retconned it. In the final game, Georgie does say this whole laughing dialogue, but only if you stand still outside the Crooked Man's door.
Am I some kind of a fucking joke to you? What did I tell you, eh? Stop laughing at me. Oh yeah? Mate, I ain't scared of you.
There, it's implied that the Jersey Devil is the guy who was laughing, and not Mary. The second important clue is that Georgie is in some way responsible for the ribbons and their curse. Episode 4, as I mentioned before.
Oh, that's enough. Mirror, vanish, cancel!
What the hell are you doing?
Is honestly a clusterfuck of weird stuff. The scene at the butcher's is very long and unedited. I can only imagine how many different iterations this scene went through because it was a nightmare trying to organise all of this stuff. Let's start off with an interesting dev note. I think the idea here was to give us a free walk section in the butcher shop, without showing us that the butcher pressed the button, like he does in the final game. Also in this version, the butcher would explain the operation a bit. It also mentions that Lily would have picked up her glamour from here. Bigby asks how he can find the Crooked Man, until Dee shows up. I don't know where to begin with these next lines. Just read them. By the way, all the spelling errors here are theirs, not mine. Whoever wrote this shit needs to go back to primary school. Anyway, horrendous grammar and spelling issues aside, from what I can gather, Bigby and Dee get into a fight, and it gets kinda... how do I put this? Homoerotic? It's pretty weird. Dee would be held captive in the glamour room with the chains, and Bigby would try to get information from him. It gets pretty violent and disturbing. You'd be able to flick a cigarette in his face, burn him, and even go as far as cutting either one of his fingers off or his entire hand. Bigby would then hang Dee up like meat, with the option of killing him while the butcher watches. As you can see, the scene kept changing quite significantly throughout development. The biggest tell is that the spelling improves. Enough about that though. The second last text file we have is related to the Crooked Man's lair. Somehow. It has text that does not depict a scene that ever happens in the final game. I get the impression that the Crooked Man's place was a lot bigger than just a hallway and single room it is in the final game. And fun fact, it's mentioned as early as episode 1. There's a bunch of very weird, clearly early texture files from an earlier version called Man Cave. Some of these textures are used here, but others aren't. There's a few others implying we'd see the Crooked Man's bedroom at one point, where it lists a TV, a nightstand, and a wardrobe. These texture files are only present in episode 1. Well, anyway, like the previous text files, this one also gives us an impression of how different a game it was. Bigby would enter through a door portal, same as the final game, but instead of meeting Tim, he'd face a goblin guard and something called a troll mother, who are incidentally mother and son. They would block access to the Crooked Man's place, which of course would only serve to piss Bigby off. One of them mentioned that he can determinately kill the Jersey Devil by dismembering him. We do impale him with his own antler, but he doesn't die from it. Maybe that was originally the case. Bigby could then grab the troll mother and stick her head through the portal. Of course, when the portal moves, the troll mother will be decapitated. What is it with Bigby being a psychotic maniac in these earlier versions? I mean, I know he needs to get stuff done, but this is a bit out of hand. It's not as if they've attacked him yet, they're just doing their job by telling him to fuck off. Bigby can then kill the troll mother and even compliments how much of a clean cut the wound is. Sorry, who is the villain in this story again? It's also implied but not explicit that the goblin would attack him, but Bigby would kill him and move forward. He could also determinately talk them out of it. Even this scene with the troll mother went through changes, as they changed it to just guards instead. Again, I have not altered any of these quotes. They are exactly as they are written. There's some earlier Tiny Tim dialogue where he was much more abrasive with Bigby. He mentions how his family died and the reason he's working for the Crooked Man is to support himself. But later on, he says, Bigby reveals to Tim the reason behind the murders, even though he hasn't learned that yet. Interestingly, the dialogue with Mary and Georgie is mentioned here again. There's also this line.
He said it! He said it!
Lastly, I want to talk about the chat we have with Nerissa in episode 5. Before that though, I would recommend watching Dan Puggs' video showcasing a cut hub that allowed Bigby to see the aftermath of a post-Crooked Man Fabletown. We'd be able to use the magic mirror to check up on people and see how they were getting by. It wasn't cut for a dumb reason. It was cut because of development time. It's very unfinished, and this was the start of the worst Telltale crunch culture, as they began serious production work on Game of Thrones, Tales from the Borderlands, as well as finishing Season 2 of The Walking Dead, all at the same time. It's sad but indicative of what was going on at Telltale. Well, anyway, let's finish off with a final conversation in the game. This scene was pretty much always the same. But what's interesting about it is it seems as though the choice of either going to the pudding and pie or chasing the crooked man was actually a choice, and you could only go to one location. A dev note explains that Georgie and Vivian are dead, and it's Vivian's ribbons that kept the girls silenced. The player obviously wouldn't know this if they chased the crooked man. I think this is one of the few changes in the game that I actually agree with. It would be even more confusing than it already is if the player didn't see for themselves why and how the ribbons kept the girls silenced. But there are still questions that don't ever get answered, but actually do in the cut dialogue. First, let's go through a very brief rundown of Nerissa's conversation and events of the story. Nerissa basically explains how all of this started, and admits lying about the crooked man's involvement. It's basically this. Some of the girls had a plan to leave the pudding and pie. They were effectively enslaved because of the ribbons. Faith wasn't confident in the girls' plan, so she stole a photo of Lily, dressed as Snow, with Crane. Crane is one of Crooked Man's allies, and it would be very grave for them all if they got caught. Nerissa decides to tell Georgie about the stolen photo, hoping they'll be spared for honesty. Georgie decides to speak with the Crooked Man about it and smooth things over. Georgie leaves and returns with an update. He says that they've committed treason and so must be punished. Faith walks in on this discussion between the two, leading to Georgie pulling the ribbon and apparently killing Faith. Nerissa tried to warn Lily, but she wasn't with her scheduled appointment, the Woodsman. Lily is later found dead. Nerissa leaves Faith's head at the Woodsman Apartments, hoping for Bigby or the business office to take notice. At the trial, Nerissa lied about the Crooked Man giving the order to kill the girls. She did not hear it from him, but she believes it did come from him. Bigby in the business office would never have noticed the death of the girls had Nerissa not brought attention to it. That is why she left Faith's head at their doorstep. Now for the unanswered questions. Nerissa mentions that the girls had a plan, and the reason Faith stole the photo was as a backup. The photo was not part of the original plan. But Nerissa never explains what the original plan actually was, or why Faith stealing a photo of Crane is leverage for it. Well, it gets explained here. So, Crane told Lily and the girls that if he can be with her, he'll find a way to get their ribbons removed. Faith didn't trust Crane and was worried that he might go to the Crooked Man about them trying to escape, instead of helping them. So she stole the photo as blackmail just in case. Unfortunately for the girls, Crane noticed the photo was missing, and so hired Dee and Dumb to track it down, which is why we see both of them in the Woodsman's place and Faith's apartment. Nerissa gets worried and decides to speak to Georgie about it. And well, you know the rest. This definitely shouldn't have been left out. It explains a pretty crucial part of the plot. I have to assume it was a mistake that they left it out. But there's a problem. The bizarre circumstances surrounding Lily's death. For one, it's never explained how Lily was killed or what happened to her. Holly claims in episode 1 that her sister has been missing for weeks. But there's no way that can be true with what we know. Let's just consider this non-canon, as to not confuse things. All we know is that she was in a room that was covered in blood, and her headless body was discovered in the park at the bottom of the river. Well, yet again, the answers to these questions are explained in cut dialogue. It's not clear how Nerissa would know this, seeing as she also didn't know that Lily wouldn't be meeting the Woodsman that night. It could very well be a lie. But there's yet another problem. Faith filled in for Lily's appointment with the Woodsman because Lily was going to be with Crane that night. The problem with this is how would Nerissa know to warn Lily? Now technically, this isn't actually a flaw. This could very well just be another lie by Nerissa. But there's also another very good question that even I didn't think of, even though it's a pretty damn good question to ask. Who placed Lily's head at the Woodlands right at the end of episode 1? Well, once again, we get an answer to this question. So Georgie or someone he knows did it. Okay. The game also brings up two other things that have bothered me to no end since Wolf finished. And surprisingly, the text acknowledges it, but doesn't provide an answer. Faith's head and body. From what we know, the head was given to Dr. Swinehart, and while we see him, we never get any kind of coroner's report or information about it. They even replay Snow's line about it at the very end of the game.
Did Dr. Swinehart ever get back to you about
He
things?
said he wanted to run more tests. I hope you find.
Looking at this cut dialogue though, it's hinted at that Nerissa did something with Faith's body, but we don't have Nerissa's side of the conversation. So, that's about it. As we know, she walks away and repeats the same line Faith says at the start of the game. It's implied that Nerissa was Faith all along. I never really understood why Faith would need to pretend to be someone else. We know for sure that someone who looked like Faith was murdered. That much is obvious. Georgie admits to it. And if it really was Faith walking away at the very end, then where is Nerissa? We know that Georgie didn't kill Nerissa. We first see Georgie and her at the same time. So it's not like Georgie killed Nerissa, then Faith took Nerissa's place. Next time, plan your story out so we don't have all these unanswerable loose ends. I'm talking to you, ad hoc. All of that aside, there's cut dialogue that only seems to cement the theory that Nerissa was Faith. If I were to cut anything from this conversation, it would be that line. Just leave it at goodbye. The Crooked Man is finished, the girls have been saved, and Snow is taking charge. Big changes are coming to Fabletown. We really didn't need a throwaway twist that doesn't add anything to the story. Well anyway, that's about it for this video. I think I covered most of the interesting stuff that was cut from this game, and hopefully you enjoyed it. But this case is still not over. There's still one missing piece to address before we finish all of this up. But that will have to wait until my next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around, Wolf. Among Us fans.